Hey, what's going on? This is Dylan with Dylan Talks Tone. Today we're going to talk about tremolo stability, how to keep your guitar in tune if you've got one of these things on it. This is going to apply to pretty much anything with one of these, even Bigsby's. They're got some little things to them, but the principles are still going to apply. Floyd Rose, not so much. That's a whole different video. If you want me to do a video about Floyd Rose stuff, let me know, put it in the comments, and I would be happy to do that. This is going to probably apply to most of your Strat style tremolos, whether it's 6-screw, two screw, or you're going to have like a Bigsby is. There's a few specific things. We have some pretty good videos about that, but overall, I want to just kind of give you the concept of it. Before we get into this video, one thing: this video is sponsored by Audible. So if you are a book person, or if you're not a book person, actually. But you like learning stuff. I believe it's always important to continue to learn things. So I do that by reading. I know a lot of people use like forums on the internet and stuff, but I feel like reading a book is the most effective. It's just still the best, right? Problem is, none of us have time and we want to multitask. So listening to it in the car, listening to it on some earbuds, wherever, having audiobooks, to me, is the way to go. Right now, I'm listening to two. I'm listening to one by Tim Ferriss called The 4-Hour Workweek because I'm constantly working on personal efficiency. And the other one I'm listening to is a Native American history book called Black Elk Speaks, about a Native American man who lived into the 40s, was there for the dying of Custer, all that kind of stuff. Really opened my eyes to the history of Native Americans because I am Native American and I find it very fascinating. Really, really cool book. Make sure you check it out. You can get, I think, 2 free books and a trial in the link in the description below. So make sure you do that. Okay, let's talk about this. First of all, a tremolo works by having the strings are obviously pulling this way on the bridge, and the springs back here are pulling the opposite way to keep the bridge down to the body. You can set this up to float to where it's like floating a little bit off the body, and it can get those like warbles, for example, like with like a Jeff Beck kind of thing. We have a video on that. I'll put a link to it up here. If you want me to do another video on that, let me know. I can show you how to float one of these things in just a few minutes and have it really good. But a lot of people get super frustrated with tuning stability because they start to try to float them and do all those various things and it won't stay in tune. So then they end up just locking the thing back down, putting a block in it, doing something like that. So let's break this down. Obviously, we have 2 different opposing forces. Strings going this way, springs going the other way, and we're trying to equalize that and make sure that everything returns to pitch. See, that's the thing that we're trying to do with this, is we're trying to use the trem, but we want the string to return to its original tension and its original pitch. First things first, make sure you understand what string gauge you're using, and with a tremolo guitar, stay consistent. Use the same gauge of strings on that guitar all the time. That will get rid of many of your headaches, because once you get this figured out, then it'll be super simple. The next thing is make sure that those strings are stretched. You can take your thumb and your forefinger and you can kind of go like this and stretch the length. Put your thumb up or your finger up here on the first fret so you don't break your nut, and then you can actually stretch those strings. Do it a couple of times. We have a video about this too, but it will basically make it to where the strings will be a lot more stable. It will play in a lot faster and you won't have to fight them for 2 or 3 days after you put a new set on. Once we have the tension kind of where we want it by gauge and make sure that the strings are good, then the next thing is basically just interference and friction. Tremolos all have the same problem. There's no science to this. They all have the same problem. So let's get into how to troubleshoot it. So this is something I have to do. This is a brand new build. I just built this guitar, and this is something I do with every one of them from the beginning. That's why I used it, because it has some of the tremolo problems that you probably run into, on a daily basis. So we're going to use this guitar as an example. So what we're going to do is we're going to hook it up to a tuner, and we're going to check each string individually and make sure it's in tune. All right, so we've got all of our strings in tune. Everything is the way we want it to be. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna exercise our tremolo a couple of times. Now we're gonna check our tuning again. Now, if a couple of the strings are off, you should just be able to give it a couple of pops like that and they'll come back. So in this instance, the unwound strings are going a little bit sharp. So what that's telling me is that we have a friction problem somewhere, okay? So all this really comes down to, it's not rocket science, all this really comes down to is friction. What we're doing when we use the tremolo, on this type of a pivot tremolo, we're shortening the string. It's actually moving this way. So it's going that way, and then what it's typically doing is sliding in the nut and then coming back. So if we push this down, the string goes this way, and then it slides back. If here's what happens though, if it's not correct, is we push the string, push this down, it doesn't slide here, or it slides this way a little bit, but then it doesn't come back, and then when we let it go, the string goes sharp. Because it's actually, so for example, in this case, when it goes sharp, it's actually, the string is sliding forward, but then when we let go, it's not sliding back, so it stays there and it pulls the string tighter and makes it sharper. It's just a friction thing. So I'm having that issue on the unwound strings. So what that basically means is the nut is too tight on the unwound strings. So how do we fix that? We have a set of nut files. We'll leave a link to these in the description below. These are the ones I like. They're from Japan. They work really good. I've had them for about 5 years and I'm just now getting to the point where I need to replace them. We pull that string out of that nut, and we're not looking to make it deeper. What we're looking to do is just see if there's any burrs in there. Now on a used guitar that you've been playing for a while and it develops this problem, a lot of times it's just some goo that's messed up in there. When I make a nut from scratch, a lot of times the nut slot is a little bit tight, which is what is the case here. But for you, it's probably just going to be some sort of buildup, some sort of plastic flashing, especially if it's a plastic nut, and you'll just want to clean that out. So it should just take a few strokes like that back and forth with that nut file. Tune it back up to pitch. And now we're good. Now we're staying in tune on that string. Move to the next one. Tune it to pitch. That one's doing the same thing. It's going a little sharp. So we grab the appropriate nut file. I just pull the string out of the slot there. We grab the appropriate, that would be the 13 for the B. And we do the same thing. We just make sure that we're cleaned out, that we have a wide enough and clean enough nut slot. When I make these from scratch, sometimes there's like a little hair of plastic or something in there that, well, these are tusk nuts, and so sometimes there might be a little hair in there. If it's a bone nut, sometimes there's a little bit of, bone doesn't actually clean out very good when you're filing it. You have to make sure it stays cleaned out. So sometimes that can get a little hung up in there. And so we just work this back and forth a couple of times and we're good. So usually, so let's do that again. We'll go ahead and, now when you're doing this and yanking around on the guitar like that, make sure that you check all your tuning, because we're talking about tension here all the way across the whole guitar. So we want to make sure that the tuning is checked across the whole guitar every time, but then at the same time go back and double check each string individually for this motion that we're looking for. And there we go. Now we're staying in tune on that string, and we move on to the next one. Now here's the thing. If we have a problem with a string and we don't have a set of nut files, there's a couple of cheats you can do. You can take string ends. When you change your strings, you can take string ends and you can cut them off. Like when you put your strings on, you can cut those off and save them. Okay, do this with a new set of strings, put it on the guitar, do the stretching, do all that kind of stuff, and then keep those ends. On the unwound strings, you can like rub them on some concrete or on some sandpaper or something, and they get a little rough, and you can use that as a nut file to clean out that slot so that you don't have that friction in there. Now on the wound strings, they've got windings, and you can use that instead of using a nut file, because if you don't have a set of nut files, just a piece of string will work perfectly. Work through each string individually. Most of the time it's not all of them. Most of the time it's one or two. Sometimes it's the G string, sometimes it's the low E, it depends. And like for example with this guitar, it's probably going to be the G string and the D string because of the angle and the way it goes through the peg head. So that can produce a little bit of friction if it's not 100% perfect. So you go back in there and just make sure it's perfect. And then once it's perfect and you have sliding back and forth like it's supposed to. See, a lot of times, and if it goes sharp like that, a lot of times if you pull on the string, now it's at the correct pitch. You know there's a friction problem because that string was grabbing and holding individual strings. The other thing I would check, maybe even before you get to the nut stuff, making sure you don't have any friction in the tremolo itself. Now, that can be caused by interference from, like, for example, if the springs are touching the side of the guitar right here, if the block itself is touching the side of the guitar right here. And then on a 6-hole tremolo, it can also be caused by the screws, these 6 screws right here, being too tight. Because what will happen is people want to tighten those things down, and as this tremolo comes forward, it cannot rock on this little angle in here so that the tremolo works correctly. Now, the other problem is, though, you don't want to go too loose, because what will happen, and I've had this happen before, if you've got a couple of these too loose, then as you push down on this, the tremolo will actually rock like that, and it will cause tuning instability as well. So you want to make sure that these are just loose enough. I tighten them down until they're flat and you can't actually move the tremolo, and then I back them out about a quarter to a half a turn. It depends on the thread pitch of the screws, but usually it's about push them all the way down and then pull them out about a quarter to a half a turn typically. And then you'll be able to see that thing rocking back and forth perfectly. And if you put kind of some light underneath there, you can kind of see and make sure that it is actually doing it evenly across, that you don't have one side lifting more than the other and causing some sort of tuning instability. I'm going to go through and just fine tune a couple of little things here, but I think we're good. We had the problem on the top 3 strings, the EA and the EB and the G, and I feel like they really work a lot better. They've got a lot less friction. If you do not feel comfortable with, the nut might need more work than that. You might actually have to send it to somebody if you're not comfortable with that. But just moving back and forth a couple of times with some rough strings or some nut files, we'll put a link to them in the description that you can get for your kit. It's definitely worth it. You'll have a lot less frustration. On a Bigsby, it's all about friction as well, but you also have those other rollers and stuff. We'll link to we'll link to a video that we did on that before. This is probably your biggest culprit, friction in the nut. If you have any questions about this or anything about guitar setup or guitar tone, let me know. Make sure that you stay tuned for Thursday's live video because we're going to give away a bunch of guitar maintenance tools, which I'm super excited about. We'll put a link to some of those in the description if you want to buy them now. If not, we'll give them away on Thursday. I'm really excited about that. And we got some other kind of cool stuff coming too. Thank you to everybody over on Patreon who has made this possible. Here's everybody that's over there right now. I really, really appreciate the help that you've been giving us and allowing us to be able to do these kind of like monthly giveaway things. And we have some other stuff planned in the future. I think it's going to be awesome. Make sure you comment on this video because obviously that enters you to win the thing. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks for hanging out. My name is Dylan. This has been Dylan Talks Tone.